In speaking to you, men of the greatest city of the West, men of the state which gave to the country Lincoln and Grant, men who preeminently and distinctly embody all that is most American in the American character, I wish to preach not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life, the life of toil and effort, of labor and strife. To preach that highest form of success which comes not to the man who desires mere easy peace, but to the man who does not shrink from danger, from hardship, or from bitter toil, and who out of these wins the splendid ultimate triumph. A life of ignoble ease, a life of that peace which springs merely from lack, either of desire or of power to strive after great things, is as little worthy of a nation as of an individual. I ask only that what every self-respecting American demands from himself and from his sons shall be demanded of the American nation as a whole. Who among you would teach your boys that ease, that peace, is to be the first consideration in their eyes, to be the ultimate goal after which they strive? You men of Chicago have made this city great. You men of Illinois have done your share, and more than your share, in making America great, because you neither preach nor practice such a doctrine. You work yourselves, and you bring up your sons to work. If you are rich and are worth your salt, you will teach your sons that though they may have leisure, it is not to be spent in idleness, for wisely used leisure merely means that those who possess it, being free from the necessity of working for their livelihood, are all the more bound to carry on some kind of non-remunerative work in science, in letters, in art, in exploration, in historical research, work of the type we most need in this country, the successful carrying out of which reflects most honor upon the nation. We do not admire the man of timid peace. We admire the man who embodies victorious effort, the man who never wrongs his neighbor, who is prompt to help a friend, but who has those virile qualities necessary to win in the stern strife of actual life. It is hard to fail, but it is worse never to have tried to succeed. In this life, we get nothing save by effort. Freedom from effort in the present merely means that there has been stored up effort in the past. A man can be freed from the necessity of work only by the fact that he or his fathers before him have worked to good purpose. If the freedom thus purchased is used all right, and the man still does actual work, though of a different kind, whether as a writer or a general, whether in the field of politics or in the field of exploration and adventure, he shows he deserves his good fortune. But if he treats this period of freedom from the need of actual labor as a period not of preparation, but of mere enjoyment, he shows that he is simply a cumberer of the earth's surface, and he surely unfits himself to hold his own with his fellows if the need to do so should again arise. A mere life of ease is not in the end a very satisfactory life, and above all, it is a life which ultimately unfits those who follow it for serious work in the world. That is an excerpt from a speech called The Strenuous Life by one Teddy Roosevelt in 1899. It's one of his most famous speeches, for good reason, as you now know. It's pretty powerful. He's speaking to the Hamilton Club, I believe, in Chicago. Basically, laying out his life philosophy of the strenuous life. This is the first episode of this podcast that I've done like this, which will be a review or the highlights of a biography of Teddy Roosevelt called The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris. It's a 770-page masterpiece, in my opinion. If you're watching the video, you can see I have literally hundreds of notes. Teddy Roosevelt's a legend. If you don't know much about him, then you soon will. If you do know much about him, you will soon know more. He is, in my opinion, one of, if not the greatest characters that the presidency has ever seen. Probably one of the most vital and virile men that have ever lived. Let me answer this. Why am I doing the first one on Teddy Roosevelt? Because I think that he is what many of us strive to be, what many of us young men and old men strive to be, which is a man that actually lived life. The things that he did in his life are actually insane. I'll give you a little rundown before we get into the book. He was an author of some highly, highly rated books. He was the president of the United States for 2 terms. He was the vice president. He was the governor of New York. He was the police commissioner in New York City. He was the assistant secretary of the Navy. He was a civil service commissioner. He was a state legislator when he was like 23, and he became the speaker at a young age as well. He wrote Naval Warfare of 1812, or like the Naval War in 1812 or something like that, a very highly acclaimed book. As like a 21-year-old, he started it at Harvard, and it became required reading for the United States Navy. He embarked on an adventure 3 or 4 years before he died, in a river called the River of Doubt, which he literally put a part of the Amazon rainforest on the map. So he's an explorer. He was an avid hunter, hunted all over the world, hunted some of the biggest game all over the world, was one of the leading sources of knowledge and understanding on big game in America. Oh, and he was a rancher, and he had ranches in Montana. So that's a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt. If you didn't know any of that, now you know. He literally lived life to the fullest, and I admire him greatly. He's been a figure that I've looked up to for a long time. With all that said, there's actually a part in the book that explains why I think it's important to do things like this, which is to read and to learn about historical figures. In Teddy's words, here we are. I was nervous and timid, yet from reading of the people I admired, ranging from the soldiers of Valley Forge and Morgan's Riflemen to the heroes of my favorite stories, and from hearing of the feats performed by my Southern forefathers and kinsfolk, and from knowing my father, I felt a great admiration for men who were fearless and could hold their own in the world, and I had a great desire to be like them. So there's Teddy right there talking about, he's actually referencing one of his favorite poems, I believe, about King Olaf. But we can read these stories and we can learn about ourselves, who we want to be, and who these people are. We can learn about the things that they did that we might be able to do ourselves. Biographies are everywhere. There's biographies written about just about anybody that's done anything in the world. Autobiographies are also written, which are literally windows directly into the minds of these incredible people. I think that you and I would be foolish to not read, understand, and study what these people did. If we admire them, if they accomplished things that we want to accomplish as well, if they acted in such a way that we want to act, if they treated people such a way, they built a business such a way, they led people in whatever domain that we want to lead people in. If there's a person that we respect and admire and there's a book either written about them by a professional biographer or directly from their mouth, I think we'd be fools not to use that information. I think that we live life as a story. We interpret our life as a story. This is why we've been telling stories as humans for as long as we've existed. And I think that old stories help us in creating the new. So with all that said, forgive any mindless wandering. Like I said, this is the first time I've ever recorded a solo podcast in this way. So I surely hope that I do a good job, and I hope that this is valuable to you. With that said, we're going to start at the beginning of Teddy's life and kind of just go through the notes that I have in this book. Once again, it's The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris. So first off, Theodore Roosevelt was born a very wealthy man in New York City, I think 6 or 7 years before the Civil War. Very wealthy. His dad, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., inherited a lot of money from his grandfather, I believe. So that sets the stage. As he mentioned in his speech, he did not have to necessarily work for the necessities of livelihood. He was not educated in a typical way. Like his family traveled a bunch. He basically taught himself a lot of things, whether that be from studying animals. He was big into ornithology from the time he was a kid. I think his first journal entry was about birds. They would study. He lived in Germany. He spoke French, German, and English. He was reading like German poetry as like a 10-year-old or something. He was just a fascinating guy. He was very sick when he was a kid. He had very debilitating asthma, and we'll get into that. But the note I have here, the first note, is in the prologue. It's about Roosevelt as an older man. kind of sets the stage too for his life because he lived such a wide-ranging life. He had such a variety of interests. But quickly, Roosevelt is equally at home with experts in naval strategy, forestry, Greek, drama, cowpunching, metaphysics, protective coloration, and football techniques, among other things. So he was a polymath in that way. He could speak with anybody about pretty much anything, which is pretty incredible. Yeah, his dad was his idol. He said that he was his best man he ever met, best man he ever knew. He looked up to him very, very much, and it's sad, I guess. He died when he was 18 or 19, I believe, which played a pretty significant part in Theodore Roosevelt's life. He was studying at college, pretty debilitating for him at the moment. Okay, so I have a note here that says romance begins, which the reason I think I wrote that is because there's a podcast I was listening to about another book about Teddy Roosevelt called T.R. The Last Romantic. So this struck me to the book. T.D. thus, at a very early age, acquired a love for legend and anecdote and inherited a nostalgia for a way of life he had never known. The key to his imagination had been unlocked by a woman to whom the past was more real than the present. As an adult reader of history and as a professional writer of it, he always showed a tendency to live his subject. He always looked for narrative, which was instinct with the truth that both charms and teaches. So this was where his romance begins, I would say, when he was a young man reading about these stories, interacting with these people that his father was friends with, these larger-than-life figures. He was also a very prolific reader. He would sometimes read like 2 or 3 books in an evening, is what they say. But just for context here, romanticism, we kind of have a misconstrued definition of what that is. The definition of romanticism is, there's 2 that are important. Romanticism is a movement in the arts and literature that originated in the late 18th century, emphasizing inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual. And then a romantic, actually there's 2 definitions of romantic that we'll go over. The first being impractical in conception or plan, visionary. The second definition that's very important, I think, once you start to learn a little bit more about Teddy Roosevelt, you'll understand how this applies to him. Marked by the imaginative or emotional appeal of what is heroic, adventurous, remote, mysterious, or idealized. He is very much so all of those things. He wanted to live a heroic life. He spoke about serving in the military heroically since he was a kid. He wanted to live an idealized life. He was very morally upright, sometimes to the point of preaching almost, which rubbed people the wrong way. But all that said, he was kind of an odd kid. His sickness and peculiarity from a personality standpoint led him to be odd. There's a note here that said he was a queer, he was crazy, he was a bundle of eccentricities, but he was wholly interesting. So that kind of describes him as he was throughout his whole life. There's stories of him where people referred to his utter unself-consciousness. He just, it was a charm that he had that he just literally did not care about what the vast majority of people cared about, or cared about him. So he kind of just lived his life. He honestly knew that he was a little bit peculiar, I believe, and he leaned into that, which I think did him well in his political career and his time serving in the military, because he didn't try to be some buttoned-up politician. He was ruthlessly himself. On this page, I have get action. This get action is a phrase that he lived by. You'll realize this, as you can already tell by the amount of things that he did in his life. He was always acting, always doing something, always taking action in some form or another. Part of that was because his health was so bad. There's a story when he was a kid, his dad looked at him and said, TD is what they called him, and said, TD, your mind is exceptional. You have a great mind, but your body you have to make. Like your body is not on the same level as your mind, and you're gonna have to make your body. And he said, I will make my body. And so he, honestly, out of necessity, had to build his body and had to become a strong individual. He was not born that way. That is very important to understand. He, without question, created his vitality, his vigor, his vim, all those things. He without question, instilled in himself largely due to the encouragement of his father. But so this note is get action. This is from Edmund Morris. In addition to boxing, wrestling, bodybuilding, and his daily hours of recitation, the young freshman, okay, so this was when he was a freshman at Harvard. The young freshman attended weekly dancing classes, hunted in the woods around Cambridge, taught in Sunday school, stuffed and dissected his specimens, organized a whist club, I don't even know what that is, took part in poetry reading sessions, followed the Harvard football team to Yale. The fellows seemed to be, this is a quote from him, the fellows seemed to be a much more scrubby set than ours, and in time, honored undergraduate fashion, caroused with his friends, making the night hideous with his harsh, unmusical singing. So he was literally always doing something. He was moving all the time. There's a story where he played like 91 tennis games in a single day as a form of workout. He was working out vigorously all the time. This leads back to that first speech that I read. He did not want a life of ignoble ease, even though he was the guy. His family was excessively wealthy. He would never have to worry about money if he spent his money well, which ironically he did not. He was pretty notoriously bad at business and ended up having some financial troubles later in his life. But nonetheless, forever at it. So there's another thing. Somebody described him once as forever at it. So this is the note that I have here. This is also while he's at Harvard. Iron self-discipline had become a habit with him, and he plodded every day with the methodism of a Wesleyan minister. The amount of time he spent at his desk was comparatively small, rarely more than a quarter of the day. But his concentration was so intense and his reading so rapid that he could afford more time than most. That is so important. He was forever at it. Never have I seen or read of a man with such an amazing array of interest. Theodore could luxuriate in healthy tiredness, satisfied that he had wasted not 1 minute of his waking hours. His regiment was flexible but balanced. Any overindulgence in sport or flirtation would be immediately compensated for by an extra study. That's so important, and I want to talk about that for a second because it's not that he spent more time studying. He was a good student, not the best, but he was a good student. He was very studious. But he was so intensely focused during these sessions that, like it says, he would spend a comparatively small amount of time studying compared to his peers at Harvard. But he would focus so intensely that he would get his work done, and it would allow him to go row across the bay or ride his horse to Chestnut Hill to court the girl that would later be his wife. He would wrestle. He would do all those things because he would focus so intently on what he was doing at the moment, which is fascinating in my opinion. I think that's something we could all take into consideration. If we were always doing what we were actually doing, and what I mean by that is when we actually sit down to work, if we were actually working and we weren't checking our phone every 10 minutes and we weren't reading emails every 15 minutes and we weren't doing one thing while we're trying to do another. Okay, I'm going to study right now, or I'm going to do this work that I have, and I'm going to do it so intently that there's zero chance or there's zero distraction that will take me from this work. I will finish it sooner, and then you'll have more time. We will have more time to do the other things that we want to do, like Teddy did. One of the things, I don't know if this is true or not, but supposedly he drank around 1 gallon of coffee a day. In that spirit, I'm having my third right now, so maybe that helped him. Maybe it didn't. Okay, so the next note I have is doubt about father. Okay. Not really sure what that means. Oh, even he doubted, I have in the footnote. This is something that I've thought about recently as well. So we see these guys like Teddy Roosevelt, John D. Rockefeller, Napoleon, Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, all the list goes on and on and on. These guys are larger than life characters. They're in many ways our heroes. They're people that we look up to in America and really all over the world. And that list is ever expanding. It is not limited to those men that I just mentioned. But those men, we often hold those men up. We pedestalize them. We put them on this stool that's like above depression or above doubt or above worry or fear. That is so utterly false. That is a misconception that we have created in our minds. And the note that I put on this on this page is even he doubted. So this is a quote from Teddy. I often feel badly that such a wonderful man as father should have had a son of so little worth as I am. How little use I am, or ever shall be in the world. I realize more and more every day that I am as much inferior to my father morally and mentally as physically. Let that sink in for a second. Remember what I just told you about the amount of things that he did in a 60-year life. He's regarded as one of the best presidents ever. He posthumously won the Medal of Honor for his actions in the Spanish-American War at San Juan Hill and all those things that he did. And he, at one point, how little use I am or ever shall be in the world. And what you'll realize, actually, is that this will be a recurring theme in his life. And we'll touch on this in a little bit later, but this is a recurring theme for him. It's not that he was depressed all the time at all. Actually, he was not. He was a very happy, very vital individual, but he would have these seasons of depression and being down, which we'll get into how he would deal with such things, which I think is another valuable lesson for us. Okay, so here's a little story. This note is all grit. This is fascinating. He was on vacation, I believe, as a younger man. As if to seek refuge from his doubts, he decided to spend the last few weeks of his vacation in the wilds of Aroostook County in northern Maine. Arthur Cutler had hunted in the area, one of the last strands of virgin forest in the Northeast, and had suggested that Theodore might like to do the same. There was a backwoodsman there, said Cutler, named Bill Sewell. He kept open house for hunters and was emphatically a man to know. Huge, bearded, and full of lust for life, Sewell loved to shout poetry as he fought his canoe through whitewater or slammed his axe into shuddering pine trees. No doubt Cutler sensed that this magnificent specimen of manhood might satisfy Theodore's craving for a father figure. And since Sewell was humbly born, he might rub off some of the boy's veneer of snobism before it toughened into impenetrable bark. That's really good writing. Island Falls, where Sewell had his headquarters, was so remote from New York City that Theodore took 2 full days to get there, completing the last 36 miles in a buckboard. 2 cousins, Emlyn and West Roosevelt, and a Dr. W. Thompson accompanied him. The strain of the journey coming on top of his frenetic summer caused him to suffer a bad attack of asthma, and when he arrived at Sewell's homestead late on the evening of 7 September, he was wheezing. Sewell's first impression of him was a thin, pale youngster with bad eyes and a weak heart. Dr. Thompson took the backwoodsman aside, speaking of Sewell, and said, "He's strong, but he's not strong, but he's all grit. He'll kill himself before he'll even say he's tired." Sewell agreed that Theodore looked mighty pendulent, but soon found out that his appearance was deceptive. So that's important as well. He was very much so a weak, not weak, but he was a scrawny guy when he was young. You've seen pictures of him as an old guy. He became burly and brawny and had a notoriously barreled chest. But when he was a kid, he was asthmatic. He was very sick a lot of the time, and he was pretty scrawny, pretty skinny. He wasn't like a formidable physical presence, which I think is important because he made himself into that. He made himself into the physical specimen that he was and the leader and all the other things. One thing that I didn't mention earlier that I want to touch on is he kept a journal. I think his first journal entry, like I mentioned, was about like ornithology, some bird or something, for as long as he, like I think like 9 or 10 years old, he kept a journal all the time, almost every day. Sometimes in varying length, depending on what he was doing. But this is where a lot of this stuff comes from his book. This is why there's such well-documented history of his life, because he was very regimented and disciplined in his journal keeping, which I think is important. One thing to note as well, he took a lot of trips, like I mentioned. They went on like a year-long vacation to Europe when he was a kid. They went on vacation down the Nile. He was always hunting, and he was always his was more so less for sport and more for science. So he would go kill birds or rabbits or whatever, and he would stuff these animals and study them, which was an indication in a lot of ways of what he would do later in his life with conservation. He was arguably the most progressive conservationist that's ever been in the presidency of the United States, which is important. I mean, he really changed the public land scene in America. I think I mean, I don't know if the numbers are in here, but another important note. This is called The Rise of Teddy Roosevelt. This book actually cuts off right before he becomes president. So at some point we'll do another one on his post-president life because it's also very interesting. But this kind of just goes to show this is an 800-page book, nearly 800 pages of his life before he became the president. He might be one of the only people ever to have a more interesting life prior to being the president of the United States than after. So that's something to keep mind of. But back to the journaling thing, it's something that I've done. I've journaled for a long time, very hit or miss. I've gone months and months without journaling, and I've gone months where I journal it every day. It's a helpful practice, and I think it's something that a lot of these great men that we're talking about or that we will talk about do. It's definitely a common thread. It's shared by the vast majority of them. So I think that's important because it helps us be able to compare where we are from where we've been, where we started. It helps that we can look back at what happened. We can actually articulate our thoughts better. I think Jordan Peterson says that writing is the act of thinking, something like that. You have to think when you write. So even if he would often just write down what happened during the day, if anything interesting happened. He was also a prolific writer of letters. This is crazy. He wrote an estimated 150,000 letters in his life. That's insane. 150,000. I don't know the math on that, but that's like, that's a lot of letters. So there's a lot of documentation there as well that historians are able to study because he wrote so much, which is really cool, I think. It's also, I'm a huge proponent of handwritten letters. I think that slow communication is really good. I think that we should all be communicating slower sometimes. I'd actually encourage you, I've been doing this for a while, to open a few lines with loved ones, friends, mentors, whatever it is. Just write them a letter and say, hey, look, if you want to respond with a letter, that'd be great. We can become, quote, pen pals if you want to say that. But yeah, I have a couple lines open with good friends from back home, with mentors, with coaches, with family members. It's a really nice practice because you also have to delineate and consider deeply, because you don't want to just write for pages and pages and pages. You have to write what's important and what you actually want to speak about with this person. So all that to say, third coffee's kicking in. The note I have here is Romance of Nature. All right, let's see it. I don't even know what it is. Okay, so this is when he goes out west, actually, for the first time. This is in the chapter called The Dude from New York. He goes out there. He meets a young man and his father, and this is, I believe, an observation by the younger man named Lincoln Lang. Clearly, I recall his wild enthusiasm over the Badlands. It had taken root in the congenial soul of his consciousness, like an ineradicable creeping plant, as it were, to thrive and permeate it thereafter, causing him more and more to think in the broad gauge terms of nature, of the real earth. There was in the beautiful country, this is Morris now, there was in this beautiful country something which thrilled Roosevelt body and soul. As a child, hardly able to breathe in New York City, he had craved the sweet breezes of Long Island and of the Hudson Valley. Here the air had the sting of dry champagne. All his life he had loved to climb mountains and gaze upon as much of the world as his spectacles could take in. Here he had only to saunter up a butte, and the panorama extended for 360 degrees. In recent years, he had spent much of his time in crowded, noisy rooms. Here he could gallop in any direction for as long as he liked and not see a single human being. $14,000 was a small price to pay for so much freedom. Bam. That's awesome. There's so much wisdom in there, in my opinion. He was a very, very social human being. And I think we often think about our lives in siloed ways. We think about, oh, well, I'm social, so I have to be social all the time, or I'm an introvert, so I have to be introverted all the time, or I like doing X, so I have to do X all the time, or whatever it is. We think in very siloed ways. Here it says he was very social, and he would continue to do so. He would continue to be extremely social for his entire life. And there's so many stories about this, but at Harvard, for example, he was a part of, like I mentioned, he was part of like 15 clubs, it sounded like. So all that to say, he wasn't social all the time. He understood that there's a sprint rest. There's this dichotomy in his temperament. He could only be social all the time if he allowed himself the space and the freedom that for him it was the Badlands, which was South. It was, I believe it's South Dakota, or maybe it was North Dakota. It was the Dakota Territory at the time, not a state. Um, he fell in love with that place, and this freedom allowed him the reprieve and the respite to reset, reinvigorate himself, and then go back east to his duty from a family standpoint, from a governmental standpoint, and from a societal standpoint, invigorated and ready to attack. And then often throughout his life, he would take time to leave. Before he was president, before he was the most powerful man in the U.S., he would, or one of them, he would go do this. He would take time off to rest. And this is something I also think is so important, because in this grind set culture that, I mean, I'm a 25-year-old young man. I played sports in college, so I understand, like, I've been surrounded by people that work really hard, and you see these like life coaches and stuff, and like, hey, you have to wake up at 4 and work out every day, and then go to your job for 12 and a half hours, and then do nothing fun but work and work and work and work and work until you've made enough money or whatever. I'm of the belief that that's actually the amount of people that have been successful in the world that have done that, or at least the amount of people that I've read or studied or listened to podcasts about, they didn't do that. JP Morgan took 3 months off a year. He said something like he can do a year's worth of work in 9 months, not 12 months. So you take 3 months off. Teddy Roosevelt, like I said, would go on month-long, sometimes year-long hunting trips all over the world so that he could refuel, he could reset, which I think he could recharge his batteries. It's so important. Even John D. Rockefeller would spend a lot of time, especially in his middle and late years, where he would be gardening. That was big for him. Larry Ellison would take time off while he was building Oracle. He's worth $210 billion now. He would take time off and go travel or do or pursue other interests than Oracle, which I'm of the belief that that's extremely important. Maybe it's temperamental. I actually do believe it is temperamental. My temperament is much more of the sprint rest type. If I don't allow myself to explore other things or be exposed to novelty or new stimuli, then I will get bored, and that's, I don't like being bored. I find that for me, if I work really hard and then allow myself to go hunting or have a lighter workload while I'm doing something else, or like have a new stimuli or a new novelty, it reinvigorates me like Teddy Roosevelt did. So not to beat a dead horse, but I think that's really important to understand, especially as young men. I could be wrong, but we'll find out. Okay, so the part that I read about him doubting himself about his father, that was right after his father died. I think he was 18 or 19 at Harvard. And you can imagine he was the best man he ever knew, is what he said. So it impacted him greatly. Very, very profound impact on him as a young man. That's sad. That's very sad. Teddy Roosevelt dealt with an immense amount of tragedy in his life. It's actually pretty hard to even consider, to be honest with you. So that was when he was like 18 or 19, after dealing with sickness and asthma his whole life. Man, so in this book they do a good deal of there's a good deal of writing. Edmund Morris does a good deal of writing about him courting what would be his first wife, Alice Lee. Who would be his first wife, Alice Lee. She lived outside of Boston in a place called Chestnut Hill. This is just kind of cool, he would literally like gallop through these prairies, and obviously it wasn't very populated back then. He would gallop on his horse after school or after studying or whatever it was while he was at Harvard to go court Alice Lee, and she was very hard to get. He had to work for it, to say the least. She was not super inclined to want to marry him at first, but there's some really, really powerful writing in this book about Theodore Roosevelt's time courting her, which I think is awesome. He was madly in love with her from the beginning, and it took a long time, and he was persistent, and bam, they got married. Unfortunately, that led to a relatively tragic event in his life. I'll read it. If you don't know the story, brace yourself, because it's pretty profound. I can't imagine experiencing this as like a 23-year-old. You just graduated Harvard. He's in the state legislator at this point. So things are looking up. He just graduated from Harvard. He has a great friend group. He's a wealthy young man. He's gaining notoriety already. He's doing well in business. And then this happens to the book. Alice, dying of Bright's disease, was already semi-comatose as Roosevelt took her into his arms. She could scarcely recognize him. And for hours he sat holding her in a vain effort to impart some of his own superabundant vitality. Meanwhile, on the floor below, Mitty was his mother. She was like 46 or 47. Meanwhile, on the floor below, Mitty was expiring with acute typhoid fever. The two women had become very close in recent years. Now they were engaged in a grotesque race for death. Bells down Fifth Avenue chimed midnight, St. Valentine's Day at last. Then one, then two. A message came from downstairs. If Theodore wished to say goodbye to his mother, he must do so now. At 3 o'clock, Mitty died. She looked as beautiful as ever, with her moonlight complexion and ebony black hair untouched by gray. Gazing down at her, Roosevelt echoed his brother's words, "There is a curse on this house." In bewildered agony of soul, he climbed back upstairs and again took Alice Lee into his arms. Day dawned, but the fog outside grew ever thicker and gaslight continued to burn in the Roosevelt mansion. About mid-morning, a sudden, violent rainfall miraculously cleared the air, and for 5 minutes the sun shone on muddy streets and streaming rooftops. The weather seemed about to break, but clouds closed over the city once more. By noon, the temperature was 58 degrees, and the humidity grew intolerable. Then, slowly, the fog began to lift, and dry, cold air blew in from the northeast. At 2 o'clock, Alice died. Roosevelt drew a large cross in his diary for February 14th, 1884, and wrote beneath, "The light has gone out of my life." So, as you can imagine, his dad died at 18 or 19, maybe 20. He's 23 or 24. His wife, who he absolutely adores, some of his writing in his journal is so strong about how much he loves Alice. She passes away. I think she was 21 or 20, maybe 22. And his mother at 46, 47 years old died as well in the same day, same 12-hour period. His wife, or 14-hour period, his wife and his mother died. You can imagine how much that would hurt somebody. It's hard to even fathom, to be honest with you. Like, losing one of them would be enough to knock somebody off their rocker, and to do some serious damage to one's spirit. But the two most important women in his life passed away. Same house, same day. Pretty tragic. And the part, it's pretty famous, but you can actually look up the dictionary, the picture of his journal. Quite literally, a man of many words throughout his entire life. All he said was, big black X, the light has gone out of my life. And that's another reminder for me, A, that life is finite. You really gotta, you never know what's gonna happen. So it would behoove us all to keep that in mind as much as we can. It's impossible to live with it in the front of our minds all the time, but hug the ones you love, I guess, and call your mom, as a lot of country songs say. But the light has gone out of my life. Think about that. 23-year-old guy to say the light has gone out of my life. This is a powerful reminder for me that it's tough. Life is tough. It's not all sunny days and games. You know, this is tough. But for him to reach that rock bottom, that trough of his life, and then continue to climb upward ever so arduously throughout the rest of his life, and to climb to the peak of man in many ways, being able to lead a nation to really at the beginning of its journey to glory and to national or to global power. It's encouraging to me that to know that a man can go through that much tragedy and make it out on the other side all right. Just very, very sad. Let's see. Okay, so here it says, light has gone out. Let's read. This is from the book. More tears were shed at the funeral on Saturday, 16 February, in the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. The sight of 2 hearses outside the door and 2 rosewood coffins standing side by side at the altar was too much for many members of the large and distinguished congregation. Sobs could be heard throughout the simple service. The minister, Dr. Hall, could hardly control his voice as he compared the sad but unsurprising death of a 50-year-old widow with the strange and terrible fate that had snatched away a 22-year-old mother. He cried openly as he prayed for him whose life she has been so great a part. Through all these tears, Roosevelt sat white-faced and expressionless. He had to be handled like a child at the burial ceremony in Greenwood Cemetery. Theodore, in a dazed, stunned state, wrote Arthur Cutler, his ex-tutor, to Bill Sewell in Maine. He does not know what he says, what he does or says. That's something I forgot to mention. Him and his wife, Alice, they had a baby, I think, 2 days before she passed away. So it was, I think she had Bright's disease, and it was exacerbated by the birth of their child. So think about that. That's another log on the fire. He had immense love for this woman, the love of his life, he would think, and had a baby with her, a child, I think a young daughter. And 2 days later, she's gone. That's got to be a lot for a guy to handle. So pretty wild. The next note I have is, my life has been lived. Oh wow, this is another example of being in the trenches. Like it's very much so a wave. Life is a wave; it goes up and down, and this is an example of a very, very, very low trough for Teddy. To the book. With the exception of 2 brief written valedictories to Alice, one private, one for limited circulation among family and friends, there is no record of Roosevelt ever mentioning her name again. Think about that. 150,000 letters, journal entries almost every day. There is no record of Roosevelt ever mentioning her name again. This was a core philosophy of his in many ways. We'll get into this a little bit later, but it's often how he would deal with personal turmoil. He would deal with it internally. He didn't believe it was very noble or honorable for men or women, for that matter, to voice their sorrows in a lot of ways. To the book. The first of these memorials was entered into his diary a day or 2 after the funeral. Alice Hathaway Lee, born at Chestnut Hill, July 29th, 1861. I saw her first on October 18th, 1878. I wooed her for over a year before I won her. We were betrothed on January 25th, 1880, and it was announced on February 16th. On October 27th, the same year we were married, we spent 3 years of happiness, greater and more unalloyed than I have ever known fall to the lot of others. Let me reread that. On October 27th of the same year we were married, we spent 3 years of happiness, greater and more unalloyed than I have ever known fall to the lot of others. On February 12th, 1884, her baby was born, and on February 14th, she died in my arms. My mother had died in the same house on the same day, but a few hours previously. On February 16th, they were buried together in Greenwood. For joy or sorrow, my life has now been lived out. Think about that, guys. I keep coming back to this, but it's repetition's persuasive. He went on to become one of the most prolific men that the world has ever known. And at 23 or 24 years old, he thought that his life had been lived out. He had reached a peak. He was literally depressed, almost probably as depressed as you can be as a human. And he managed to keep moving forward. There's a quote in here that he says, the only thing that's left to do is to resolutely move forward. Move resolutely forward. It's how he lived his life. He never let these types of things stop him, but he did feel them. He was not some emotionless. I think, like I said, we pedestalize these guys to think that they were perfect or that they were always vital and they didn't deal with these human struggles or these struggles that we may be feeling. He was in the pit of hell at this moment in his life. He literally said, the light has left my life, and for joy or sorrow, my life has now been lived out. He was 20-something years old. It's just a powerful reminder for us that we can go through some pretty intensely painful things as humans, and we can move out and move up if we keep on taking steps forward. Okay. Note I have here is stubborn self-belief. This is when I believe he's in the state legislature. Kind of just shows he's a young man, not much experience, not much power yet, you could say. This just shows how much belief and stubbornness he had. To Boss Miller's bewilderment, Roosevelt proved no more tractable after dinner than he had been before. He not only rejected an offer to send one independent delegate at large, i.e. himself, to Chicago, Chicago's where the Republican National Convention was happening, along with 3 Blaine men. Blaine was an opponent or somebody within the national. Basically, I'll pause there. There was like independent or reform Republicans, and there was machine Republicans, is how they're referred to. I think Blaine was a machine Republican, sort of the corrupt Republicans that had been in office for a long time, and sort of very corporate backed, a lot of money being pumped into them, in that type of way. Roosevelt was an independent, so he not only rejected an offer to send 1 independent delegate at large, i.e. himself, to Chicago along with 3 Blaine men, but also refused to make the ratio 2 and 2. News of the second rejection, which leaked out about midnight, greatly excited Chairman Warren, who offered the independents 3 places on the ticket in exchange for just 1 Arthur supporter. But Roosevelt also rejected that. At 2:30 a.m., the president's men made their final humiliating offer, an offer so weak it amounted to capitulation. All 4 delegates at large could be independents for Edmund, as long as there was no danger of them ultimately switching to Blaine. Roosevelt graciously accepted, knowing very well who the latter of those delegates would be. The leader of those delegates would be. It'd be him. So think about that. He's a young dude in the state legislature, surrounded by all these people that are so powerful. For years they've been in the government, and he would not capitulate. He would not give up his territory. On the page, I said, hold the line, and he did that. He was very, very stubborn, and his self-belief was excessive. He doubted himself, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, but he, for the large part of his life, had immense self-belief, which he attributes a lot to his father, but it's also partly why he was so powerful and achieved so much. He believed in himself greatly, sometimes to the effect of arrogance. Somebody actually described him once as as like a species. They described him as he belongs to the species of genus Americanus egotisticus or something like that. So sometimes it would rub people the wrong way. Okay, so this note says mimetic desire. This exchange, in effect, ended the 3-year friendship of the 2 young assemblymen, which had never been the same since Hunt's disloyalty during the speakership contest. There is no evidence that Roosevelt took any petty offense at his colleague's words, but he knew now that it was time to unrope himself from Hunt, O'Neill, and the other Roosevelt Republicans, whose horizons extended no further than New York State, and eagerly search out new altitudes, wider vistas. So, mimetic desire is the idea that, like, we mimic the desires of people. The people that we surround ourselves with, their desires become our desires, and vice versa. It's sort of, the popular proverb is, we are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. He realized that. So Hunt, O'Neill, and other Roosevelt Republicans in New York were limited in their scope and in their dreams and aspirations. And he noticed, you know what? It's time for me to surround myself with different people with wider, at new altitudes with wider vistas. So I think that's an important lesson for us as well, to really consider who we're spending time with, and whether or not they're dragging you down or are they lifting you up. Maybe a good proxy for this, or heuristic to think about with your friends or the people you're surrounding yourself with, is if you say something like a belief or a dream that you have, or you say these big dreams, do they support you? Are they like, yeah, man, that's awesome, go for it? Are they willing to let you fail a little bit, maybe push yourself to a different boundary or expand your limits? Or do they immediately shoot you down? I would encourage you to, and this is something I need to do in my own life, I continually try to practice this, but if they're shooting you down, then they don't need to be in your life. They will continue to do so for a long, long time. And Roosevelt realized that as well. All right, the note I have here, sorrow in God's plan. Not quite sure, but we'll see. All right, to the book. I think this is Roosevelt writing in a, quote, unusually self-revelatory letter. He was writing to a friend of his in the Utica Morning Herald, which is a city in New York. To the book. I wish to write you a few words just to thank you for your kindness towards me, and to assure you that my head will not be turned by what I well know was a mainly accidental success. Although not a very old man, I have yet lived a great deal in my life, and I have known sorrow too bitter in joy. Too bitter. I've known sorrow too bitter and joy too keen to allow me to become either cast down or elated for more than a very brief period over any success or defeat. I have very little expectation of being able to keep on in politics. My success so far has only been won by absolute indifference to my future career. For I doubt if any man can realize the bitter and venomous hatred with which I am regarded by the very politicians who at Utica supported me. Under dictation from masters who are influenced by political considerations that were national and not local in their scope, I realized that very thoroughly the absolute ephemeral nature of the hold I have upon the people and a very real and positive hostility I have excited among the politicians. I will not stay in public life unless I can do so on my own terms, and my ideal, whether lived up to or not, is a rather high one. That is so important. I will not stay in public life unless I can do so on my own terms, and my ideal, whether lived up to or not, is a rather high one. For very many reasons, I will not mind going back into private life for a few years. My work this winter has been very harassing, and I feel tired and restless. For the next few months, I shall probably be in Dakota, and I think I shall spend the next 2 or 3 years in making shooting trips either in the far west or in the northern woods. And there will plenty of work to do writing. There will be plenty of work to do writing. So this is profound to me. So once again, this also kind of speaks to the ambiguity or the murkiness of the plan that we have for our lives. Here he is as a young man, once again, saying, I have very little expectation of being able to keep on in politics. He would become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a Civil Service Commissioner, a Police Commissioner, the Vice President, and the President. And here he is as a young man thinking he has very little expectation to be in politics. So it's just an interesting thing. God's plan for us is crazy. It's wild. He works in mysterious ways. But the other thing about this is it's a pretty sorrowful letter. You know, and once again we talk about the respite that he would find in the far west, which is the Badlands, in the Dakota Territory. He found a lot of solace there. It's where he would go in times of sorrow. And I think there's some real merit to that because nature is healing in a lot of ways. And I think he realized that and definitely did that in his own life. And also, like I said, just you never know where you're going to go. You just got to keep on moving forward. It's interesting to see that he thought that he wouldn't be in politics. Okay, so this note is isolation. And this is, I believe when he was out west, I could be wrong. So there's a character in here in the book called Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge was a politician as well, I believe, from Massachusetts, who became one of his best friends throughout his entire life. Like a very profound friendship. They would write letters back and forth continuously, do a lot of things together throughout their life. So a lot of the information about him and the happenings of his life are found through letters and writings to and from Henry Cabot Lodge. So isolation is the note I have. Let's see what it says. With that, Roosevelt changes trains and rumbles off to Little Missouri, which is a river in the Dakota Territory. A boyhood ambition is rising within him. He will take a rifle, load up a horse, and ride off into the prairie absolutely alone for days and days. Quote, far off from all mankind. There's another example of that isolation that he would crave. He was very social, but in times of excessive workload, excessive stress, he would seek that isolation. He would seek to be able to recharge himself and to regather his social ambitions. He needed it. He literally needed it. He craved it, which I share that with him. I very much so feel a calling to nature, and especially in times of stress, it seems to be very gratifying for him. I think that's something that we should take note of because isolation is important. You have to be able to hear yourself. It's true solitude. There's a book called Digital Minimalism written by Cal Newport, and he talks a lot about solitude and how it's being deprived of us in our modern day, like even walks nowadays in nature, which would be it would be a source of solitude if it were not for phones, podcasts, music, etc. That's very important, especially to learn and really understand who we are as people. Here, this says great writing. Okay, this is just a little indication of how good of a writer he was at times. I mean, I think he wrote dozens of books. I could be mistaken. Some of them more highly acclaimed than others, but says great writing. Let's see what it says. Now, as a 25-year-old widower with his second career abandoned, or at least indefinitely postponed, he could reopen his ears to the, quote, sweet and sad songs of the hermit thrush, the, quote, boding call of the whippoorwill, and, quote, the soft, melancholy cooing of the mourning dove, whose voice always seems far away and expresses more than any other sound in nature the sadness of gentle, hopeless, never-ending grief. So you can just tell this is very, I mean, he's down bad. He's really down bad. He's feeling it. All the loss that he's had in his life, the internal strife, and he's a very good writer. So he found a way to articulate that through the song, through describing a song of a bird, which the mourning dove specifically. So that's just interesting to me. He's a very good writer. Once again, reason we should be writing a lot more. I think writing is so important. At the end of this book, actually, Edmund Morris, in the acknowledgments, talks about Saint Bernard, who I'll actually pull it up because I find it very interesting. He says, finally, I would like to invoke the name of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who composed the most inspiring of literary aphorisms. Every word that you write is a blow that smites the devil. Very important to write. I really do believe that. We should be writing a lot. Okay, so the next note, this is powerful. This is a core ethos of Teddy Roosevelt's life. The note I have is black hair, and the quote is, black hair rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough. Black hair rarely sits behind the rider whose pace is fast enough. This was a core ideology of Teddy Roosevelt. He believed immensely in the idea that if you're moving forward at a quick enough pace, then black hair, which is depression or angst, anxiety, sorrow, whatever it is, it won't catch up to you if you're moving fast enough, which there's merit to that argument, I believe. Idle hands are the devil's playground. So if we're constantly moving, this is why vitality was so important to him and training so vigorously. He would ease his mind through extremely difficult physical labor. Like we talked about, he would summit mountains every chance he got. He, like I said, 91 games of tennis in a single day. There's a quote in here somewhere about him wanting to row across the roughest waters in the smallest boat. He was very much so inclined to move at a fast pace because he believed it helped him sort of stay in front of black hair, which he was obviously intimately familiar with. Let's see. Okay, this is interesting. This is just a little bit about his hunting. I remember seeing this as a kid when my dad was reading this book. This is a journal entry of his. It's pretty freaking insane. August 17, my battery consists of a long 45 Colt revolver, 150 cartridges, a number 10 choke bore, 300 cartridge shotgun, a 45-75 Winchester repeater with 1,000 cartridges, a 40-90 Sharps, 150 cartridges, a 50-150 double-barreled Webley Express, 100 cartridges. And so then he lists some of the game that he killed during this hunting trip. August 19th, 4 grouse, 5 duck. August 20th, 1 whitetail buck, 2 sage hens. August 24th, knocked the heads off 2 sage grouse. August 25th, 6 sharp-tailed grouse, 2 doves, 2 teal. August 26th, 8 prairie chickens. August 27th, 12 sage hens and prairie chickens, 1 yearling whitetail. 29 August, broke the backs off of 2 black-tailed bucks with a single bullet. 31 August, 1 jackrabbit, cutting him nearly in 2. 3 September, 2 blue grouse. 4 September, 2 elk. 5 September, 1 rabbit, 1 blue grouse. 7 September, 2 elk, 1 black-tailed doe. 8 September, spares a doe and 2 fawns as, quote, we have more than enough meat, kills 12 grouse instead. 11 September, 50 trout. So he's fishing. 12 September, 1 bull elk, knocked the heads off 2 grouse. 13 September, 1 black-tailed buck through the shoulder, 1 grizzly bear through the brain. 14 September, 1 black-tailed buck, 1 female grizzly, 1 bear cub. 15 September, 4 blue grouse. 16 September, 1 bull elk. 17 September, broke camp, 3 pack ponies laden with hides and horns. 40 birds, and animals on the prairie, making his total bag 170 items in just 47 days of hunting. So he killed 147 game animals in 47 days. That's pretty profound. This is a really cool story about him in Medora or near Medora in the Dakota Territory about his ranching. This just kind of shows he was very tenacious. He was a bulldog. He did not stand up for bullying, which is a core ethos of his as well, especially in his presidency and his political career. But get this. So this is when people were basically trying to blackmail him or take advantage of him. Finding Roosevelt away, the gang accepted lunch, sobered up, and rode off well stoked with beans and bonhomie. Since then, however, Paddock had begun to declare that the Elkhorn, which was Roosevelt's, the Elkhorn shack was rightfully his. If Four Eyes, referring to Roosevelt, wished to buy it, he must pay for it in dollars or in blood. Roosevelt, on hearing this, merely said, "Is that so?" Remounting his horse, he rode back upriver to Paddock's house at the railroad crossing. The gunman answered his knock. Roosevelt said, "I understand that you have threatened to kill me on sight. I have come over to see when you want to begin the killing." So it's kind of comedy, but he was a savage. He did not take bullying very lightly. He did not like it at all. Okay, here's a little excerpt just to show how incredibly unique Roosevelt was. So this is him when he came limping out of the sheriff's office. So this is after a cool story. I won't get into the actual story, but basically somebody stole his boat, or maybe two of his boats, and he went this crazy journey. I highly recommend you get this book if you actually like Teddy Roosevelt. It's absolutely fascinating. It was one of those books I did not want to put down because of stories like the one where he went and found the thieves who stole his boat. But Dr. Victor H. Stickney of Dickinson was just going home to lunch when he met Roosevelt limping out of the sheriff's office. This stranger struck me as the queerest specimen of strangeness that had descended on Dickinson in the 3 years I had lived there. He was all teeth and eyes. His clothes were in rags from forcing his way through the rose bushes that covered the river bottoms. He was scratched, bruised, and hungry, but gritty and determined as a bulldog. I remember he gave me the impression of being heavy and rather large. As I approached him, he stopped me with a gesture, asking me whether I could direct him to a doctor's office. I was struck by the way he bit off his words and showed his teeth. I told him I was the only practicing physician not only in Dickinson but in the whole surrounding country. "By George," he said emphatically, "then you're exactly the man I want to see. My feet are blistered so badly that I can hardly walk. I want you to fix me up." I took him to my office, and while I was bathing and bandaging his feet, which were in pretty bad shape, he told me the story of his capture of the 3 thieves. We talked of many things that day. He impressed me and he puzzled me. And when I went home to lunch an hour later, I told my wife that I had met the most peculiar and at the same time the most wonderful man I ever came to know. So he was a captivating character, to say the very least. He hardly did people meet Teddy Roosevelt and not feel a charged way about him one way or the other. People either disliked him strongly or they loved him and admired him and were very endearing to him. This note is self-belief. This is, like I said, a core thing of him. He believed in himself very, very strongly. The young editor reaction was immediate. Okay, so this is when he's talking to an editor of a newspaper, and the young editor to the book. The young editor's reaction was immediate. "Then you will become president of the United States," he said to Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not seem in the least surprised by this remark. Indeed, Packard got the impression that he had already thought the matter over and come to the same conclusion. "If your prophecy comes true," he said at last, "I will do my part to make a good one." So it might not have been his vision the entire time, but he believed that he could be, which is important because belief is powerful. Non-monetary reward is a note here. Okay. Oh, so I mentioned that he was not very good at business. His ranches in Dakota ended up failing. I think he lost a lot of money. I don't think he did lose a lot of money. There was a really, really tough winter that kind of just destroyed the whole cattle industry out there in general, and he was a victim of that as well. So this is him talking, or this is Morris talking, but it's about non-monetary rewards. That's the note I took. Although his Dakota venture had impoverished him, he was nevertheless rich in non-monetary dividends. He had gone west sickly, foppish, and racked with personal despair. During his time there, he had built a massive body, repaired his soul, and learned to live on equal terms with men poorer and rougher than himself. He had broken horses with Hash Knife Simpson, joined in discordant choruses to the accompaniment accompaniment of Fiddle and Joe's violin, discussed homicidal techniques with Bat Masterson, shared greasy blankets with Modesty Carter, shown Bronco Charlie Miller how to gentle a horse, and told hell-roaring Bill Jones to shut his foul mouth. These men, in turn, had found him to be the leader they craved in that lawless land, a superior being who paradoxically did not make them feel inferior. So he left without money. He lost money there, but non-monetary rewards are just as important. I think that's something we also get. I've been given a lot of advice over my time, one by a coach of mine in college that I'll never forget, basically incentivizing or encouraging me to pursue non-monetary rewards. Not everything in this life is about money. There's many other things that are important and many other rewards that can be received or gained or garnered. And as Roosevelt, as we just heard about Roosevelt, he gained a healthy body, a strong body, experiences with people that he would never, ever have had the ability to connect with. He was able to lead people. He was able to have these hunting trips, ride horses, break horses. He learned about ranching. And this would actually, like I said, he couldn't foresee this in the moment, but he became president and became the leader of the Rough Riders, which is we'll get into that in a little bit, the military regiment. He became the leader of people largely because his ability to connect with people like the poor or the inferior men that he mentioned in that excerpt. It's very important to not just seek monetary rewards. I think experiences and interesting stories are also, and just connecting with people, I think those are also very valuable rewards. At least that's something that I'm optimizing for. This is a good one. Man of ambition. So this is kind of a white pill in today's world. This is Roosevelt speaking. At no period of the world's history, says Roosevelt, has life been so full of interest and of possibilities of excitement and enjoyment. Science has revolutionized industry. Darwin has revolutionized thought. The globe's waste spaces are being settled and seeded. A man of ambition has unique opportunities to build, explore, conquer, and transform. He can taste the fearful joy of grappling with large political and administrative problems. If he is observant, he notes all around him the play of vaster forces than have ever before been exerted, working half blindly, half under control to bring about immeasurable results. Roosevelt refuses to look at the future through the dun-colored mists of pessimism, yet he does not pretend to see it all clearly. That reminds me of a verse, I think it's Esther 4:14, where he says, I think the verse is, perhaps you were brought to the kingdom for such a time as this. There's so much, especially with the election, there's just a lot of blackpilling, a lot of like negative pessimism that's pervading our society. And I think Roosevelt, in this instance, is sort of encouraging us, or maybe in this, he was writing to himself or whatever, but he was encouraging himself that life is so full of interest and possibilities of excitement and enjoyment. We live in a pretty crazy world. It's pretty profound, and I believe that it will present itself as you believe it will. And if we think it's an abundant, incredibly interesting and powerful world with many positive and great things out there to experience, then I think it will present itself that way to us. If not, then it will present itself to us in a pessimistic, chaotic, entropic, and sad, dreary way, which I don't really want to partake in. I'm sure you don't either, or at least I would hope. Let's see. Okay, so this note says seasons. On September 4th, he started west to shoot a few antelope and ponder the New York mayoralty. So he was running for mayor. I think he ended up losing that election, but nonetheless, he felt depressed and ill, and Dakota's drought-stricken landscape drove him back to Oyster Bay after only 2 weeks on the range. He sank into a mood of bitter remorse as his 36th birthday approached, for he felt himself a political failure. So in this time, he had been remarried, he had had kids, I think that was after he was police commissioner or civil service commissioner or whatever, but I'm not sure. I think he failed the New York mayoralty, or at least didn't get the nomination that he wanted, which, once again, political failure at 36. He became the president, he thought he was a political failure, but he became the president 7 years later or something like that. So you just never know if you keep moving. This is the type of, he was incorruptible at large. This is why people didn't like him, because he could not be controlled by the powers that be. He was not able to be corrupted by these career politicians and these corporate-backed politicians. There's stories about him when he was the police commissioner of New York, which was notoriously corrupt, and he was having none of it. Sometimes he would go through the city at night, like in the middle of the night, as the commissioner, and patrol and see what the cops were doing that were supposed to, like the police that were on duty, see what they were doing. So there's an instance here, briefly, he walks into a bar and he sees this, or into a saloon and sees a patrolman. Roosevelt entering. Why aren't you on your post, officer? Officer Rath. What the is it to you? I'm sure you used a profanity there. The counter guy, the guy who was working the saloon, said, "You got good nerve coming in here and interfering with an officer." Roosevelt said, "I'm Commissioner Roosevelt." Police officer Rath said, "Yes, you are. You're Grover Cleveland and Mayor Strong all in a bunch. You are. Move on now." The guy working at the counter said, "Shut up, Bill. It's his nibs." "Sure. Don't you see his glasses?" Roosevelt said, "Go to your post at once." And the patrolman ran out to go to his post. So that's just it's kind of funny because, I mean, it was really corrupt. They were not doing very well as a police force, and Roosevelt was having none of it. And that's just a funny story. Okay, so this note says child. So this is why he's on the police commission. He was the president of the police commission board, I believe, in New York. Okay, years later, when events had conspired to embitter her toward him, this is about some relatively irrelevant character. She wrote that the peculiar attraction and fascination of the young Theodore Roosevelt lay in the fact that he was like a child, with a child's spontaneous outbursts of affection, of fun, and of anger, and with the brilliant brain and fancy of a child. So he's just an interesting guy. I said return to child. There's verses about return to childlike faith. This also has to do with the utter unself-consciousness that I mentioned earlier. He was almost incapable of being self-conscious. I heard one story where he had like a 2-hour dinner and spoke for 1 hour and 56 minutes with other people. So he just had this peculiar but endearing characteristic of not being self-conscious about what other people thought. In much of the same way a child does. A child doesn't really care what you or I or people think just because they haven't been influenced or programmed into thinking that way. So very interesting. I think that's something we can all learn from. I think we'd all be better off. I don't know anybody who would disagree with the fact that, or the idea that we would all be better off if we did not care as much what other people thought, if we had more unself-consciousness like Roosevelt. That's really, really profound, and it was something that he carried with him. He understood that he was peculiar. Like, he knew that, but he did not care. He leaned into it, which is all the more fascinating. Obviously, that's going to rub people the wrong way. And an interesting thing about Roosevelt, it talks about it in here all the time, is that his predisposition was to like everybody. He liked everybody until he didn't. He was a very cordial, very polite. Sometimes people would get pissed off at how polite he was if it made them feel uncomfortable. Until you cross him, in which he was a pretty formidable enemy, and he would treat you as such. So I just think that's an interesting thing to think about in our own lives. Like, how can we become less self-conscious? How can I return to a childlike unself-consciousness of other people? You know, it seemed to do Teddy Roosevelt pretty well. And it's also just the acceptance of the fact that not everybody's going to like you. And if you're a friend to everyone, you're a friend to none, as the proverb says. It's powerful. All right, so this says speak softly. This is a little bit of an indication. His foreign policy when he was president was described as the big stick policy: speak softly and carry a big stick. Let's see what this is. Diplomacy, Roosevelt insisted, is utterly useless when there is no force behind it. The diplomat is the servant, not the master of the soldier. Okay, so that's really important, actually, in my opinion. Jordan Peterson talks about this. A good man is not a harmless man. A good man is a very dangerous man who has it under voluntary control. In the inability to do anything or to impart any power or strength or control over somebody, there's no virtue. Like, if you can't do anything, there's no choice because you can't do anything. As Roosevelt's saying, It is utterly useless when there is no force behind it. You actually have to be able to back it up. You have to be able to choose to be diplomatic. You have to be able to choose to be empathetic and caring and virtuous. You can't just be a weak, harmless coward, for lack of a better word, and consider yourself a virtuous human being. I don't believe that to be the case at all. And that was very, very core to Roosevelt's uh, principles throughout his life. Okay, so this quote, I said power. So let's see. This is somebody speaking about him, I believe. So White, whose worship of the gold dollar amounted to religion, flinched at his blasphemy. Within another hour, he was converted. I have never known such a man as he, and never shall again. He overcame me. He poured into my heart such visions, such ideals, such hopes, such a new attitude toward life and patriotism and the meaning of things as I never dreamed men had. So strong was this young Roosevelt, hard-muscled, hard voice, even when the voice cracked in falsetto, with hard, wriggling jaw muscles and snapping teeth, even when he cackled in raucous glee. So completely did the personality of this man overcome me that I made no protest and accepted his dictum as my creed. Power. That is a powerful individual. To be able to, I mean, that's another man writing that about Roosevelt. He had this ability to captivate people in a very, very strong way. And this also goes back to the romantic comment about believing in the ideal, which is like the perfect, like the pinnacle of humanity. Believing in it first off, and then believing that you can actually work your way towards it as an individual, and that you can, as an individual, bring society along with you to that ideal. Here he is saying, he poured into my heart such visions, such ideals, such hopes, such a new attitude toward life and patriotism and the meaning of things. Roosevelt was romantic. He believed not only that he and his fellow men could bring forth the ideal, he believed it was our duty. In the speech that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, he goes into that a little bit more in depth, but he believed it was our duty as men, especially as Americans, to live an individually virtuous and idealized life if we could, like to aspire to the ideal, but also as a nation, we should do the exact same as with the individual, as with the nation. So I don't know. I just found it very profound how powerful he was. I mean, he literally overcame this guy who actually was embittered or in opposition to him, and he ended up saying, so completely did the personality of this man overcome me that I made no protest and accepted his dictum as my creed. That was the power that Roosevelt had. He was a very charismatic dude, extremely charismatic. So something we can learn from there is to cultivate charisma. I think that's also a skill that we can do. Teddy Roosevelt was not always extremely charismatic. So the next note, quote, I must go, politics to battle. Okay, so this is, I believe, when he is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had been warning people about war for a long time, preparing people for war. He wanted the military to be stronger. I don't think that he thought the current government was doing a good enough job to prepare the U.S. for war, especially in Navy, in regards to the Navy, as the Navy was becoming a significantly more and more important part of battles in war. So for once, he wrote calmly, reasonably, without any attempt at vulgar bravado. Pardon me. I say quite sincerely that I shall not go for my own pleasure. On the contrary, I should consult purely my own feelings. I should earnestly... Let me start over. I say quite sincerely that I shall not go for my own pleasure. On the contrary, if I should consult purely my own feelings, I should earnestly hope that we would have peace. I like life very much. I have always led a joyous life. I like thought and I like action, and it will be very bitter to me to leave my wife and children. And while I think I could face death with dignity, I have no desire before my time has come to go out into the everlasting darkness. So I shall not go into a way with any undue exhilaration of spirits or in a frame in any way approaching recklessness or levity. But my best work here is done. One of the commonest taunts directed at men like myself is that we are armchair and parlor jingoes who wish to see others do what we only advocate doing. I care very little for such a taunt, except as it affects my usefulness, but I cannot afford to disregard the fact that my power for good, whatever it may be, would be gone if I didn't try to live up to the doctrines I have tried to preach. So there he is talking about being congruent with what he's preaching. Uh, that's really just living an honest life, saying, doing, and thinking, and espousing the things that he actually tries and does live by at large. He's the assistant secretary of Navy here, and the war breaks out with, or it's about to break out with Spain and Cuba, and people thought he was literally crazy. I think I have um, maybe not, but people thought he was literally crazy. They were like, "This guy has lost his mind." Because he wanted to go to the war. He like volunteered. He wasn't a military man. He volunteered to lead a regiment, and people literally thought he was crazy. I'm trying to find a quote. Nonetheless, just take my word for it or read the book. These people were like, this guy's actually lost his mind. He's insane. Why would he be taking? Why would he be leaving this position that he's worked for so long to lead a military regiment, an army regiment in battle? It doesn't make any sense. Nonetheless, he did it, and he felt that it was his duty to do so, that he may be living up or living congruently with the things that he had preached his entire life. I don't know about y'all, but that's pretty relatable to me. I have every interest in living a congruent life. I don't want to, I think the dissonance, that's where a lot of shame, guilt, worry, anxiety, depression, fear, all those things come from dissonance between who we say or think or hope ourselves to be and what we actually do, and who we live in how we live in the real world, how we actually live as men and women. But I don't know. I just think that's really profound to think. He was wealthy at this point again. He lived a very comfortable life. He had a mansion in Sagamore Hill outside of New York. He had 5 or 6 children, a wife that he loved, that was beautiful and loved very much. He had a decent job. He had a good job, great job. He was the assistant secretary of the Navy. He loved Washington, D.C. because he was a very social person, as we've mentioned several times. He was always meeting with people, going to dinners. There's stories in here about him wooing or shocking or surprising people in like ornithology clubs, and then going to talk about naval history with people, and then being like, oh my gosh, this guy's incredibly knowledgeable. And then going to talk about some obscure part of history, and then going to hunting clubs, one of which he founded, the Boone and Crockett Club, still in existence today, extremely important for hunting in America and the conservation of American big game and their habitats. You should look into the Boone and Crockett Club. Maybe I'll do a book on that later, because it's fascinating how important that is. He loved it. He loved all of this. Like you said, he loved life very much, but he felt it was his duty to live up to the things that he'd been preaching. So he not protested, but he requested on several occasions to, if war broke out, to be a leader of a regiment, of a volunteer regiment. And I'm guessing that you've heard of that regiment. It was called the Rough Riders. I would assume that you've heard of that. If not, they were a volunteer cavalry division, which means they rode horses. They trained in San Antonio. They were basically comprised of, important note here, think about what I said about the non-monetary rewards, going out west and connecting with people, getting onto a level playing field as this, quote, dude, which actually, this is a funny little interjection. Dude is basically, it was used as like a kind of a derogatory term for city guys who would try to like come out and be like fake Westerners or fake cowboys. So think twice about the next time you say dude to your friend. Also, you think about like dude ranches. That's pretty much what it was. Nonetheless, he was this guy who was from the East. He, as they mentioned in the beginning of the book, he was pious in a way. Like, he had this sort of snobbishness to him. I mean, he went to Harvard. He was extremely wealthy. He grew up in the wealthiest part of the country on Fifth Avenue in New York. But he was able to humble himself and perform in such a dutiful, heroic, and disciplined way that he earned the respect of all these cowboys, these Indians, these people that lived, these frontiersmen. The Rough Riders were comprised of in large part, these types of people. And then, interestingly enough, also people from Boston and New York, the people that he grew up with. So it's this beautiful conglomeration of the people from his childhood and his youth and like the urban wealthy areas that he's from. I think one of them was like the captain of the football team at Yale or Harvard or something like that. And there's rowers and all these Ivy League athletes that get put into battle with these cowboys, these Indians, these frontiersmen, completely different lives, completely different outlooks on life, but they came together under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt. Back to Esther 4:14. Perhaps you were brought to the kingdom for such a time as this. What better man to lead these people, this group of completely like separate people, the cowboys and wealthy Ivy Leaguers, like they're completely different. Teddy Roosevelt lived in the middle of those two worlds and was able to hold them both and lead them both very valiantly. They, like I said in the beginning, he posthumously won the Medal of Honor because they performed with exceeding heroism in the Battle of San Juan Hill, I believe. Okay, so this note here says leader. Let's see. Let me see what's going on here. Okay, so here's an interesting note. Okay, so in Cuba, it was a horrific war, very, very hot, not very well managed logistically, actually pretty poor from the American standpoint. They were on the front lines, and there was no like resupply. The back end of the military was doing a poor job of getting the people on the front line foods. So Roosevelt went back to like the camp or the front line or the place where they were holding supplies. And this is a little story. Roosevelt had learned enough during his 6 years as a civil service commissioner not to protest with attitude. He merely went outside for a moment. Oh, hold on. Let me go back. There were indeed at least 1,100 pounds of beans available, so he went into the commissary and demanded the full amount for his regiment. The commissar reached for a book of regulation and showed him that under subsection B of section C of Article 4, something like that, beans were available only to officers. Roosevelt had learned enough during his 6 years as civil service commissioner not to protest this attitude. He merely went outside for a moment, then returned and demanded 1,100 pounds of beans for the officers' mess. The commissar said, "But your officers cannot eat 1,100 pounds of beans." Roosevelt responded, "You don't know what appetites my officers have." The commissar said, "I'll have to send the requisition to Washington." Roosevelt said, "All right, only give me the beans." The commissar said, "I'm afraid they'll take it out of your salary." Roosevelt said, "That will be all right, only give me the beans." And the reason I said leader, that you want, I mean, that guy, I mean, that's a lot. That says everything that you need to know about this guy. He was a ride or die for his regiment. There's actually several stories of this, similar things where he would pay for things on his own salary because the logistics were so bad in the military down there. He would just pay for things and give them to his men. There's another example. Man, this is awesome. He would not walk, or he would not ride his horse. They did this march, excruciatingly long, arduous march, and he had a horse because he was an officer. I know I mentioned they were a cavalry division, but they ended up training for cavalry fighting and things like that. But then in Cuba, the military didn't let him use horses, which is funny enough. But he had a horse because he was an officer, and he wouldn't ride it in this march because he said, "I will not ride when my men are walking." So this is how he earned the respect of his men, and I think this is also an example of us, or for us, anybody who's a leader out there, which I believe we all are, whether we know it or not, never asking your men or your colleagues or your employees or your family or your children or your wife or whatever to do something that you're not willing to do. He lived up to that, and he earned the respect of these guys to an excessively high degree. They loved him. Okay, here's an example. Roosevelt asked the men to come forward and shake his hand. Oh, this is when they're saying goodbye. So this is cool. Roosevelt asked the men to come forward. This is after the battle, the war in Cuba. Roosevelt asked the men to come forward and shake his hand. "I want to say goodbye to each one of you in person." Company ranks were formed, and the Rough Riders began to pass by the colonel in single file. Many cried openly as they walked away. "He was the only man I ever came in contact with," confessed one private, "that when bidding farewell, I felt a handshake was but poor expression. I wanted to hug him." Roosevelt had a compliment, joke, recognition, or ready identification for every man. So he knew this is like 750 people or something like that at the end of the war. I think it was like, almost 1,000 people. He had a joke, compliment, recognition, a ready identification for every man. He cared about these men immensely. And the other thing is these are like tough, roughneck guys. Like these are cowboys, frontiersmen, dudes that did not cry. They were not like these guys that are just crying at the end of movie type dudes. They were serious, hard neck, very tough individuals, and he was making them cry openly as they said goodbye. That's how much they loved him. That's exciting to me. That's uh, extremely encouraging and uh, I don't know. I just think as a leader, like if you had that ability to be that respected by a group of people, especially in the domain of battle, that's pretty damn powerful. Imagine what we're doing in our lives, or what we can do in our lives to lead the people around us better in a more respectful way. That would elicit that same type of endearment, especially from guys like that. Another example. Oh, this is just a really, really cool wrapping up. So he was basically like, they were leaving they were back in America and they were leaving. And he said, within 24 hours, the first U.S. volunteer cavalry was dissolved. So all things pass away, Roosevelt sighed to his old friend Jacob Riis, but they were beautiful days. So that's a little nostalgia for you. I think that was a really cool way, but they were beautiful days, that romantic nostalgia that he had for those types of things. I mean, he's talking about an extremely gruesome war that they just fought, in which a lot of people died, and he almost died many times, and people that he was very close with died. So all things pass away, but they were beautiful days. And I think that's kind of speaks to the fact that there's some quote, I'm blanking on who said it, but like oftentimes the hardest ones, maybe it's Nietzsche talking to Jung or something like that in that school of philosophy, talking about how you'll look back at the hardest days as the most beautiful. And I think that rings true, especially for Roosevelt, as he just mentioned. Okay, so here's him talking about himself, and the note is action. Roosevelt, who shared the ability to double dictate with Napoleon, did not think his intellect was in any way remarkable. Okay, pause there. Double dictate means like he would have stenographers writing on typewriters, and he would be dictating a book about ornithology or historic account of some governor or senator or whatever. And then in the middle of that, he would dictate to another stenographer letters and personal writings. So he would like stop in the middle of a paragraph about studying or about a book about some historical figure and then write a letter to somebody else and then go right back to the book and not skip a beat. So think about that in the context of what he's about to say. Roosevelt did not think his intellect was in any way remarkable. I have only a second-rate brain, he said emphatically to Owen Wister, but I think I have a capacity for action. And that leads me to my last, one of my last notes. Of all the things that I've gotten from this book, the romanticism was big. I think that's a pretty impactful idea for me to consider romanticizing our own lives and how we can do that and how we can. It just gives us that motivation and that inspiration to be able to actually make a difference positively, which I found to be very invigorating and inspiring, and something I aspire to implement in my own life and to romanticize my own life. But the most important thing for me from this book and from studying Teddy Roosevelt, which I will continue to do for a long, long time, is his capacity for action. He acted. Get action was one of his life paradigms or his life aphorisms. He would not stop acting. He even said, I don't think I have a very strong brain or strong mind. I just have a capacity for action. He was, quote, forever at it. He was, quote, a man of action. All these things, he was just never not acting. He was taking action, iterating, never ruminating excessively or succumbing to analysis paralysis. I'm sure he had moments of this, but at large, his life was one lived in action, which I think is really, really cool. Even like the idea of writing, like, so he was a very reflective guy. He would write a lot. He would, especially in his older age, I'll say he was very reflective, but he was writing when he was thinking and writing, but he was always acting. It was really profound and it impacted me greatly. Here's the second to last note. Is also, the note says action too, which is kind of funny. The candidate, this is when he was the governor. I think he was a vice presidential candidate for William McKinley, and he was campaigning. So he was still the governor at the time, but a vice presidential nominee. The candidate was cheerfully agreeable. I am as strong as a bull moose, he assured Hannah, and you can use me to the limit, taking heed of but one thing, and that is my throat. He did not wish to seem to be neglecting his duties of governor of New York, but fortunately, July, August, September, and October are months in which there is next to no work. Although that quarter of a year, accordingly, Roosevelt crossed and recrossed the country with such numbing frequency and such an incessant outpouring of his familiar political philosophy as to blur the sensibilities of all but a cataloger. Suffice to say that he traveled farther and spoke more than any candidate, presidential or vice presidential, in 19th century history, with the exception of Bryan himself 4 years before. But Bryan in 1900 could not match Roosevelt. By 3rd November, the governor had made a total of 673 speeches in 567 towns in 24 states. He had traveled 21,000 miles and spoken an average of 20,000 words a day to 3 million people. The following timetable of one undated campaign day survives the diary of an aide. 7 a.m. breakfast, 7:30 a speech, 8 a.m. reading a historical work, 9 a.m. a speech, 10 a.m. dictating letters, 11 a.m. discussing Montana mines, 11:30 a.m. a speech, 12 o'clock reading an ornithological work, 12:30 p.m. a speech, 1 p.m. lunch, 1:30 p.m. a speech, 2:30 p.m. reading Sir Walter Scott, 3 p.m. answering telegraphs, 3:45 a speech, 4 o'clock meeting the press, 4:30 reading, 5 o'clock a speech, 6 o'clock reading, 7 o'clock supper, 8 to 10 speaking, 11 p.m. reading alone in his car, 12 p.m. bed. So just think about that. Like, this guy lived life, man. That stuff, that fires me up. It's this idea, like, he didn't have social media and he didn't have these distractions. There was obviously distractions. There's been distractions for as long as men have existed. But he was so ruthlessly intentional and focused on what he was doing and forever acting. He was always acting, taking action, just pushing his vitality to the literal max for much of his entire life. I very much so am inspired by that. I draw a lot of inspiration from that idea, and I think we all can as well. The other thing that this reminds me of is just the idea, like, how much could you get done? How much action could you take if you didn't distract yourself, if we didn't distract ourselves with social media, with video games, with sports, with watching sports, with whatever it ends up being? If we didn't distract ourselves, how much could we do? How much action could we take? How much more of life could we experience outside of the screens that are so pervasive in our lives? Something to think about. I think Roosevelt did a phenomenal job of that, and like I said, that is the biggest note I'm taking from the first time reading this book. Surely not the last. Okay. This is the ending. This is an example of really good writing, but it's also really appropriate way to end this book of the more or less the first half of Roosevelt's life. To the book. Roosevelt was not a reflective man, nor was he prone now in his early middle age. He would be 43 in 6 weeks' time, to long for the past as much as he used to. But the news of President McKinley's accident and the unavoidable horrid thrill of being, if only for a few hours, the likely next president of the United States, seems to have temporarily awakened his youthful tendency to nostalgia. Writing to Jacob Riis a few days before, he had said that a shadow had fallen across his path, separating him from those youthful days which he would never see again. Here, if ever, was an opportunity to look around him at all these lower hills. Let me pause. So he was the vice president under William McKinley as the president. McKinley was assassinated or was shot. At this point right now, he does not know if he's going to live. It's looking like he's actually going to live. So, sorry for not interjecting there, but or for not saying that on the front end. But he's in New York. He went on a hike to this top of this mountain. So this is why he's talking about hills. He was at the peak of this mountain, or this New York hill. I'm going to restart this because it's important. So with that context, he's on a hike. President McKinley is recovering from being shot. Roosevelt was not a reflective man, nor was he prone now in his early middle age, he would be 43 in 6 weeks, to long for the past as much as he used to. But the news of President McKinley's accident and the unavoidable horrid thrill of being, if only for a few hours, the likely next president of the United States, seemed to have temporarily awakened his youthful tendency to nostalgia. Writing to Jacob Riis a few days before, he had said that a shadow had fallen across his path, separating him from those youthful days which he would never see again. Here, if ever, was an opportunity to look around him at all these lower hills and to think of the hills he had himself climbed in life. Pilatus as a boy, Katahdin as an underclassman, Chestnut Hill as a young lover, the Matterhorn in the ecstasy of honeymoon, the Bighorns in Wyoming with their bugling elks, the Capitol Hill in Albany, that freezing January night when he first entered politics, Sagamore Hill, his own fertile fortress, full of his children and crowned with triumphant antlers, the hill in Washington where he twice laid out John Wanamaker, that lowest yet loftiest hills in Cuba where, like King Olaf on small Sir Horn, he planted his shield. Now this, would he ever rise any higher? Or was McKinley's recovery a sign that the final peak he had so long sought would after all be denied him? Mist rolled in again, and Roosevelt descended 500 feet to take a little lake named Tear of the Clouds, where his party unpacked lunch. It was about 1:25 in the afternoon. As he ate his sandwiches, he saw below him in the trees a ranger approaching, running, clutching the yellow slip of a telegram. Instinctively, he knew what message the man was bringing. That message, if you did not pick it up, is that he would become the president of the United States because McKinley died. So he would go on to become the president of the United States for the remainder of that term and then win another election, and his life was far from over at that point. This book was absolutely phenomenal. I legitimately couldn't put it down. And like I said, I mean, I don't even know how many notes we just went over, but I had more notes than that too. So I enjoyed it thoroughly. I think we can all learn from Teddy Roosevelt immensely. I'm going to have some detailed show notes in the description of this, also available on the podcast website, if you want to look back over those and see what's going on. As I wrap up, I kind of want to talk about how I see this podcast moving forward. I think this will become a core part of the podcast, reading books and highlighting them. I've mentioned Founders Podcast on this podcast many, many times. It has changed my life more than any other podcast. If I were being honest, maybe Rogan's, because it was what got me to be into podcasting. But it's changed my life. The idea of reading these books and learning about these people, we have insights into their brains. We can literally see how they lived. We can see how they operated. We can see their pitfalls and their triumphs and their angst and their self-belief and what they longed for and what they achieved, what they fell short on, how they treated people. I resonate with this stuff so much, man. I love stories, as you've also heard me say on the podcast before. I learn the best through stories. I remember in math class, like the word problems were always the only ones that I would do well on because I could like see it in a story format. I very much so see these being tools in our tool belt. I just can't, I don't know. I just can't say it enough. I think if you want to become the best man that you can, I just don't see how reading about the best men that have ever been is not a part of that. So all that said, I hope you enjoyed this. This will be a more consistent thing. I'm thinking once every other week, I'll do a book highlight. So that's what we'll start out with. Maybe it'll increase, maybe it'll decrease. We'll see. I'll still do conversations, probably 2 or 4 of those a month with the book readings in between. But yeah, that's where I'll leave it. If you want to get the book, there'll be a link in the description. It will be an Amazon affiliate link. If you buy the book with the link, I'll get like a small percentage. So you'll be supporting the podcast at the same time. With that said, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you all have a good one. Thanks.